I stood there in the grand foyer of Gloria's Connecticut mansion, the kind of place that screamed money and perfection, with its polished wood floors and chandeliers that glittered like they were mocking me. For 5 years, I'd been trying to fit into Clara's family, my wife's family, but it was like trying to squeeze into a suit 2 sizes too small. Her mother, Gloria, was the queen bee, always dressed in something expensive, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Then there were her sisters, Paige and Felicity, both just as elegant, just as quick with a jab or a laugh that left me out in the cold. From the day Clara and I said, "I do," they'd treated me like I was part of the furniture, there, but not worth noticing. Family vacations? They'd planned them without even a whisper my way. Inside jokes? I was always the one left staring, pretending I didn't care. I'd grin through it, swallow the sting, all for Clara. She'd just shrug it off, her soft voice saying, "It's how they are," like that was supposed to make it okay. I'd nod, let it slide, because I loved her, because I wanted her to be happy. But this Thanksgiving, something in me shifted. I wasn't just the quiet guy in the corner anymore. I walked through that front door with my head up, my boots heavy on the floor, and a sealed envelope tucked inside my coat pocket. It wasn't much to look at, just a plain white thing, no writing on it, but it felt like a brick in my hand. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with it yet, but I knew it was time to stop smiling and start standing. The air smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon, and the chatter of the family filled the space, loud and bright. Gloria was already holding court in the dining room, her laugh ringing out like she owned the world. Paige and Felicity were right there with her, tossing their hair and talking over each other. Clara squeezed my arm as we walked in, her smile warm but distracted, like she was already halfway into their orbit. I hung back, watching them, feeling the familiar twist in my gut. 5 years of this, 5 years of being the guy they didn't see. I tried everything to win them over. I'd fixed Gloria's car once, spent hours under the hood while she sipped wine and didn't say thanks. I'd listened to Paige ramble about her job, nodding like I cared about her office drama. I'd even helped Felicity move into her old apartment, carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs while she complained about the heat. None of it mattered. To them, I was Clara's shadow, nothing more. But that envelope in my pocket? It was my way out of the shadows. I didn't know if I'd use it today, tomorrow, or next week, but it was there, waiting. The dining room was a blur of motion, plates clinking, wine pouring, the grandkids running around with their sticky hands. I took my usual spot at the end of the table, the one nobody cared about, and watched them all. Gloria's voice cut through the noise, bragging about some new client she'd landed for her catering business. Paige chimed in with a story about her latest promotion, and Felicity was showing off pictures of a condo she'd just bought. Clara laughed along, her eyes bright, and I felt that old ache again. I wanted to belong here, with her, with them. But I didn't. Not yet. The meal went on, and I stayed quiet, picking at the stuffing, letting their voices wash over me. Every now and then, Clara would glance my way, her smile soft, like she was checking I was still there. I'd nod back, keeping my face calm. But inside, I was turning that envelope over in my mind. What was I waiting for? Why was I still sitting here, taking it? The answer hit me as Gloria clapped her hands to signal dessert, because I'd been waiting for the right moment. And maybe, just maybe, that moment was coming tonight. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the paper, and took a slow breath. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about all of us. I sat at the end of Gloria's long, fancy dining table, the kind that probably cost more than my truck, watching Thanksgiving play out like it always did. The room smelled like sage and butter, and the table was a work of art. Floral centerpieces with little pumpkins tucked in, plates piled high with gourmet stuffing, and turkey carved so perfect it looked fake. Gloria was in her element, her voice loud and proud as she bragged about Paige's big promotion at some marketing firm. Paige smirked, soaking it up, while Felicity jumped in with details about her new condo, how it had a view and granite counters. Clara's dad, Walter, nodded along, sipping his wine, and the grandkids giggled over their mashed potatoes. I stayed quiet, like always, just a shadow in their bright, shiny world. Nobody asked me anything, nobody looked my way. I was invisible, same as every year. After dinner, the plates got cleared, and Gloria clapped her hands, her rings flashing under the chandelier. "Time for gifts," she announced, like it was some grand tradition. She loved this part, playing the generous queen. She handed out designer bags to Paige and Felicity, all leather and logos, and a fancy wine subscription for Clara. Walter got a set of golf clubs, shiny and new, and even the grandkids got tablets, their little faces lighting up as they tore into the boxes. I watched it all, my hands in my lap, waiting. Then Gloria turned to me, her lips curling into that sweet, venomous smile she saved just for me. "Oh, we just forgot about you," she said, her voice dripping with fake pity. The room erupted in laughter. Paige's sharp cackle, Felicity's high-pitched giggle, even Walter's low chuckle. And Clara, my Clara, laughed too, her head tilting back like it was the funniest thing she'd heard all day. My wife, laughing at me with them. It hit me like a punch, but I didn't flinch. I'd taken worse from them over the years. I'd sat through their jabs, their little comments about my job at the garage, my old jeans, my simple life. I'd smiled through it, told myself it didn't matter. But tonight, that laugh, Clara's laugh, cut deeper than I expected. I felt the weight of it, 5 years of being the guy they forgot, piling up in my chest. I took a slow breath, keeping my face steady, and reached into my coat pocket. My fingers closed around that small envelope, the one I'd been carrying all day, and I felt a calm settle over me. "That's okay," I said, my voice even, loud enough to cut through their chuckles. "I didn't forget about you." The laughter died down fast, like someone flipped a switch. Gloria's smile faltered, just for a second, and Paige shot Felicity a quick look. Clara tilted her head, confused, but I didn't meet her eyes. I stood up, slow and deliberate, and pulled the envelope out. It wasn't much to look at, plain white, no name, no fuss, but it felt heavy in my hand, like it carried all the years I'd been sitting here, taking it. I stepped forward and held it out to Gloria. "Happy Thanksgiving," I said, my tone flat. She stared at it, then at me, her perfect eyebrows lifting like I'd just handed her a dirty rag. "What's this?" she asked, her voice sharp, but she took it anyway. The room went quiet, all eyes on her, on me. Walter leaned forward a little, curious. Paige crossed her arms, and Felicity tapped her nails on the table, impatient. Clara's hand brushed my arm, light and quick, like she wasn't sure what I was doing but wanted me to stop. I didn't. I just stood there, watching Gloria's manicured fingers slide under the flap. She pulled it open, and I saw the exact moment her face changed, her eyes narrowing, her mouth tightening. She didn't say anything yet, just stared at the papers inside, and I knew the shift had started. This wasn't their game anymore. It was mine. I'd spent too long at this table, forgotten, laughed at, pushed aside. Not tonight. That envelope was my seat, my voice, my turn, and they had no idea what was coming. I stood there, my boots planted on Gloria's pristine hardwood floor, watching her hold that envelope like it might bite her. The dining room was still, the air thick with the smell of leftover turkey and the tension I'd just dropped into the middle of their perfect Thanksgiving. Clara's family stared at Gloria, waiting for her to say something, but she just kept looking at the papers she'd pulled out, her fingers trembling a little. She'd opened it with that smug look she always wore, like nothing could touch her, but now her face was frozen, her eyes darting over the words faster and faster. I could almost hear her brain scrambling to catch up. Paige leaned over, her blonde hair brushing the table, trying to peek. "Mom, what is it?" she asked, her voice sharp. Felicity scooted closer too, her eyes narrowing like she sensed trouble. Clara turned to me, her brow wrinkling. "What did you give her?" she said, soft but confused. I didn't answer her yet. I just kept my eyes on Gloria, waiting for it to hit her fully. See, Gloria had this side business, a luxury catering company she never shut up about. She'd go on and on about her fancy clients, her 5-star reviews, how she was the best in Connecticut. I'd heard it all, sitting quiet at this table year after year, while she acted like I didn't exist. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been paying attention. For the last year, I've been digging. It started small, just a hunch. I'd overheard her on the phone once, talking about some offshore thing, and it stuck with me. I'm no accountant, but I fix cars for a living. I know how to figure things out, piece by piece. So I started looking into her books. Quietly, carefully. Nights after Clara went to bed, I'd sit at my laptop, chasing leads, calling in favors from a buddy who knew tax stuff. What I found wasn't just sloppy paperwork. It was a mess of lies, tax evasion, sure, but more than that. Embezzlement. Offshore accounts with names I didn't recognize. Thousands of dollars siphoned from family accounts, including Walter's retirement fund and the girls' trusts. It was all there in black and white, neat as you please, in that envelope. I'd spent weeks putting it together, every page a little stab back at the years they'd ignored me. Gloria's jaw tightened, and she flipped through the stack, her breathing getting shallow. This is nonsense, she said, but her voice wasn't steady anymore. Paige snatched a page from her hand, scanning it. What the hell? She muttered, her eyes widening. Felicity grabbed another, her mouth dropping open. Mom, this says you moved money from my account last year. What is this? Walter, who'd been quiet, reached over and took the whole stack from Gloria's shaky grip. His face went dark as he read, his thick eyebrows pulling together. Gloria, he said, low and hard, explain this. She tried to laugh, but it came out weak, like a cough. It's nothing, Walter. He's making it up. You know how he is. She shot me a look, pure venom, but I just smiled, small and calm. I'm not that clever, I said, but I am thorough. Clara's hand grabbed my arm now tighter. Where did you get this? She asked, her voice shaking a little. I turned to her, meeting her eyes for the first time since I'd handed it over. I got it from the truth, Clara. Took me a year, but I found it. She blinked, like she didn't know me, and I guess maybe she didn't, not this version of me. The room turned into a storm after that. Paige was yelling now, pointing at a line about her grandfather's trust. You took money from Grandpa's account? You told me it was gone. Felicity's voice overlapped, high and furious. And this says you wired 10 grand to some account in the Caymans? While I was begging you for help? Gloria tried to talk over them, her hands flapping like she could wave it all away. You don't understand it. It's business, it's complicated, but nobody was buying it. Walter kept reading, his face getting redder, and I stood there, watching it all break apart. That envelope wasn't just papers. It was a bomb, and I just lit the fuse. 5 years of being furniture, and now they couldn't look away. I leaned against the wall in Gloria's dining room, arms crossed, watching the whole scene unravel like a bad movie I'd seen coming for miles. The air was heavy now, the smell of pumpkin pie and wine turning sour with the tension. Gloria sat there, clutching the edge of the table, her knuckles white, while those papers I'd given her lay scattered in front of her like a confession she couldn't take back. The silence was gone, replaced by a mess of voices, angry, confused, hurt. Walter held the stack I'd put together, flipping through it slow, his face getting darker with every page. He wasn't a loud guy, never had been, but the way his hands shook told me he was boiling inside. Gloria, what is this? He said again, his voice rough, like he was trying to keep it together. She didn't answer right away, just stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Paige was on her feet now, one of the pages in her hand, her eyes wide with disbelief. Why is my name on a withdrawal from Grandpa's trust? She demanded, jabbing the paper with her finger. You said that money was tied up in investments gone. What is this, Mom? Felicity wasn't far behind, her voice shaking as she waved another sheet. You told me you couldn't help with my student loans, said you were strapped. But this says you moved $15,000 last spring. Where did it go? Gloria's head snapped up, her eyes darting between her daughters, then to Walter, then to me. I could see the panic setting in, the way her perfect mask was cracking. You're all overreacting, she said, forcing a laugh that didn't land. He's twisting things. You know how he is, always looking for attention. She pointed at me, her nail polished and sharp, like she could pin it all on me and make it stick. I didn't flinch. I had some free time, I said, keeping my voice steady, while you all were busy forgetting me. That shut her up for a second, and I saw Clara wince out of the corner of my eye. She was still sitting, her hands in her lap, looking at me like I'd just grown horns. Where did you even get this? She asked again, quieter this time, like she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. I didn't look at her. I couldn't, not yet. I kept my eyes on Gloria, watching her squirm. Walter turned another page, his jaw tightening. This says you took 50 grand from our joint account 2 years ago, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I never signed off on that. Where's the money, Gloria? She stammered, her hands flapping again. It's for the business, Walter. You know how catering works. Cash flow, investments. Paige cut in, her voice sharp enough to slice through steel. You mean like the new car you bought last summer? Or those trips to the spa you kept bragging about? Felicity jumped in too, her face red. Or maybe that condo deposit you said came from a bonus. You've been lying to us, to all of us. The room turned into a courtroom, fast. Gloria tried to stand, to take control like she always did, her voice rising. You don't understand how hard I work for this family. I built that company from nothing. You think it's easy keeping us in this house with all this? She waved her arm around, like the chandeliers and the fancy plates could back her up. But it wasn't working. Walter dropped the papers on the table with a thud, his eyes locked on her. "You've been stealing," he said, flat and final. "From me. From the girls. From your own father's trust." That hit her hard. I saw it in the way her shoulders slumped, just for a second, before she straightened up again. "That's ridiculous," she snapped, but her voice was weaker now, less sure. Paige wasn't letting it go. "How long, Mom? How long have you been doing this?" Felicity piled on, tears in her eyes. "Did you even care what it did to us?" "I sold my car because you said you couldn't help me, my car, Mom." I stood there, watching it all, feeling the weight of that envelope still in my bones even though it was out of my hands now. The perfect dinner, the perfect family, it was falling apart, piece by piece, and I'd made it happen. Clara's voice cut through, small and tight. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said, looking at me now, her eyes searching. I met her gaze, just for a second. "Would you have believed me?" I asked. She didn't answer, and that was answer enough. I watched Gloria's empire crumble right there in her fancy dining room, the kind of place that used to feel untouchable to me, with its high ceilings and walls lined with framed photos of her perfect life. The smell of burnt candle wax mixed with the leftover turkey, making the air feel stale and heavy. Those papers I'd handed her were still spread across the table, a mess of numbers and lies she couldn't hide from anymore. Walter sat there, his big hands flat on the wood, staring at the last page like it was a death sentence. Gloria was on her feet now, her voice loud and sharp, trying to claw her way out of the hole I dug for her. "You're making this up," she snapped, pointing at me like I was some criminal mastermind. "This is all fabricated. He's jealous. He's always been jealous of us." Her eyes were wild, her hair slipping out of its perfect bun, but I just stood there, calm as could be, letting her words bounce off me. I'd heard worse from her over the years. Walter didn't look at me, though he looked at her, his face hard. "Gloria," he said, slow and heavy, "you drained our retirement account?" His voice cracked a little on that last part, and I saw the shock hit him full force. 50 years of marriage, and here he was, finding out his wife had been picking his pockets. Gloria's mouth opened, then shut, then opened again. "It's not like that," she said, her tone softer now, almost pleading. "I had to move some money around. The business needed it. Walter, you know how tough it's been." But he wasn't buying it, and neither was anyone else. Paige was pacing now, her heels clicking on the floor, her voice shaking with anger. "You said you didn't have anything left," she said, glaring at her mother. "You told me the trust was dry. That's why I've been killing myself at work. But you've been hiding money?" Felicity was right behind her, her hands clenched into fists. "You guilt me into selling my car last year," she said, her voice breaking. "I was crying to you about how broke I was, and you were wiring cash to a private account in the Caymans? Are you serious, Mom?" Gloria's mask was gone now, her poise, her control, all of it melted into a sweaty, desperate panic. She turned to Walter, reaching for his arm, but he pulled away, his eyes still on those papers. "How much?" he asked, quiet but firm. "How much did you take from us?" She didn't answer, just shook her head, like if she stayed quiet it'd all go away. But the evidence was real, I'd made sure of it. Every bank statement, every wire transfer, every fake invoice I'd tracked down over the last year, sitting alone in my garage after Clara went to sleep. I'd printed it all out, organized it neat and tidy, and now it was tearing them apart. Clara was watching me, her face pale, her hands twisting in her lap. "Did you know it'd be like this?" she asked, her voice small. I shrugged, keeping my tone even. I knew it'd be the truth. That didn't sit right with her. I could see it in the way her lips pressed together, but she didn't say anything else. The room kept spinning out of control. Paige grabbed another page, her voice rising. "This says you took 20 grand from my wedding fund. My wedding, Mom. You said it was a bad year for the business." Felicity was crying now, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "And you let me think I was a burden, asking for help. How could you do this?" Gloria tried to rally, her voice loud again. "I did what I had to do. You don't know what it takes to keep this family going. None of you do." But it was too late. Walter stood up, slow and heavy, like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw something break in his eyes. "You didn't do this for us," he said. "You did it for you." That hit her like a slap. She flinched, her hands dropping to her sides. The girls stopped yelling, just staring at their parents, and for a second, the room was quiet except for Gloria's shaky breathing. The queen was falling, right there between the wine glasses and the pumpkin pie, and I'd pushed her off the throne. I didn't feel good about it, Not exactly, but I didn't feel bad either. 5 years of being nothing to them, and now they'd never forget me. I stood there in Gloria's dining room, the chaos swirling around me like a storm I'd kicked up, and it felt strange. Part of me wanted to step back. Part of me wanted to watch it burn. The table was a wreck now, papers scattered, wine glasses tipped over from Paige's pacing, and the air smelled like spilled Merlot and betrayal. Gloria was still trying to hold it together, her voice shrill as she waved her hands at her family, but the cracks were too big to patch. Walter sat heavy in his chair, those papers I'd given her clutched in his hands, his face a mix of hurt and fury. Paige and Felicity were tag-teaming her now, their voices loud and overlapping, throwing accusations like punches. "How could you lie to us like that?" Paige snapped, her arms crossed tight. Felicity's eyes were red, her voice breaking. "You watched me struggle, Mom, and you didn't care." Gloria spun on them, her hair wild, her face flushed. "Don't act holier than thou," she shouted. "You liked the gifts, the vacations, the nice things. I did this for all of you." That set them off again, and the room turned into a shouting match, everyone talking over each other. I stayed quiet, leaning against the wall, letting it play out. Then Clara's voice cut through, sharp and close. "Did you do this to humiliate her?" she asked, stepping toward me, her eyes locked on mine. I turned to her, surprised she was even talking to me after everything. Her face was tight, her hands clenched at her sides, and I could see she was mad. Mad at me, not just her mom. "No," I said, keeping my voice calm, steady. "I did it because the truth deserves daylight." She shook her head, fast, like she didn't believe me. "This was low," she said, her words hitting me harder than I expected. My Clara, my wife, siding with Gloria even now. It stung, deep, but I didn't let it show. "What your mom did was low," I said, nodding at the papers. I just turned on the light. She opened her mouth to argue, but Paige cut in, her voice booming. "No, what Mom did was low. How long has this been going on, huh? How many years have you been stealing from us?" Gloria spun toward her, desperate. "I wasn't stealing. I was managing, keeping us afloat." "You don't know what it takes." But nobody was on her side anymore. Walter looked up, his eyes tired, and shook his head. "You managed us into nothing, Gloria," he said, his voice flat. That shut her up for a second, and I saw the fight drain out of her, just a little. Felicity wiped her face, glaring at her mom. "You always made it about you, your business, your image. We trusted you." The grandkids had slipped out at some point, probably scared off by the yelling, and I didn't blame them. This wasn't a family anymore. It was a battlefield. Gloria tried one more time, her voice softer, almost pleading. "I gave you all so much. Don't you see that? I made mistakes, but it was for us." Walter snorted, a bitter sound. "For us," he said, holding up a page. "You took my retirement, the girls' futures. How's that for us?" That's when it broke. Whatever was left of their loyalty, it snapped. Paige turned away, shaking her head, and Felicity just stared at the floor, tears dripping. Clara stayed by me, but she wasn't with me. Not really. Her eyes were on her mom, like she wanted to fix it, like she couldn't let go of that old bond. I felt it then, the fracture between us, deeper than I'd realized. Gloria sank back into her chair, her hands covering her face, and for a second, I thought it was over. But then Walter clutched his chest, a sharp grunt escaping him, and everything stopped. His face went pale, his breath ragged, and he slumped forward, the papers falling from his hands. Felicity screamed, a high, panicked sound, and Paige lunged for her phone, yelling, "Call 911." Clara dropped to her knees beside him, her hands on his arm, whispering, "Dad, hold on, hold on." I stepped forward, pulling out my own phone, my voice clear as I talked to the dispatcher, address, symptoms, everything I could think of. Gloria just stood there, sobbing loud and dramatic, hovering behind everyone like she was in a play. But I saw it, she didn't touch him, didn't help. The room turned into chaos, and I stayed steady, waiting for the sirens, knowing this was just the start of the mess I'd uncovered. I stood in the middle of Gloria's dining room, the sound of Walter's shallow breathing still echoing in my ears as the medics rushed in, their boots loud on the hardwood. The place was a mess now, chairs pushed back, papers strewn across the table, a wine glass shattered on the floor where Paige had knocked it over in her panic. The air smelled sharp, like fear and antiseptic, and the flashing lights from the ambulance outside cut through the windows, painting the walls red and blue. Felicity was crying, her hands shaking as she hovered near the medics, yelling, "Is he okay? Please, tell me he's okay." Paige was on the phone, her voice tight as she gave someone directions to the hospital. Clara knelt beside Walter, holding his hand, her face pale and streaked with tears. I stayed back, giving them space, but I kept my eyes on everything, making sure the medics had what they needed. I'd already told the dispatcher the basics, heart attack, maybe, based on how he'd grabbed his chest, and now I just watched, my heart pounding but my head clear. Gloria was a mess, sobbing loud and dramatic, pacing behind the medics like she was the star of some tragedy. "Oh, Walter, my Walter," she wailed, her hands fluttering to her face, but I noticed she didn't get close, didn't touch him. It was all for show, and I wasn't the only one who saw it. Paige shot her a look, pure disgust, and muttered, "Save it, Mom," before turning back to the medics. They got Walter on a stretcher fast, his big frame looking smaller somehow, and Clara followed them out, her voice shaky as she said, "I'm coming with you, Dad." The rest of us piled into cars, a frantic scramble to the hospital, and I drove behind Felicity's sedan, my hands tied on the wheel. The ride was quiet, just the hum of the engine and the occasional sniff from Paige in the passenger seat. She didn't say much, just stared out the window, her arms crossed like she was holding herself together. I didn't push her to talk. I figured she'd had enough for one night. At the hospital, we ended up in a waiting room, all hard chairs and fluorescent lights that buzzed too loud. The smell of bleach stung my nose, and the TV in the corner played some dumb infomercial nobody watched. Felicity sat with her knees pulled up, her face buried in her hands, while Paige tapped her foot nonstop, her eyes on the double doors where they'd taken Walter. Clara came out after a while, her eyes red but dry now, and sat next to me without a word. I wanted to ask how he was, but her silence stopped me. Gloria was there too, still playing the grieving wife, sniffing into a tissue she'd grabbed from the nurse's station. "I can't believe this is happening," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've always done everything for this family." Paige snapped her head around, her voice low and furious. "Don't start, Mom. Not now." Felicity looked up, her face hard. "You think this is about you? Dad's in there because of you, because of what you did." Gloria's mouth dropped open, but she didn't fight back, just dabbed her eyes harder. I could see it. She was losing them, all of them, and she knew it. The matriarch act didn't work here, not with Walter fighting for his life, and those papers still fresh in everyone's minds. Clara shifted beside me, her shoulder brushing mine, but she didn't look at me, didn't say anything. I felt the distance growing, a cold space I couldn't cross. The hours dragged on, and nobody spoke much. The grandkids were with a neighbor now, safe from all this, and I was glad for that. They didn't need to see their family falling apart. A doctor finally came out, his face tired but calm. "He's stable," he said, and Felicity let out a sob of relief. "It was a heart attack, but he's responding to treatment. You can see him soon, one at a time." Clara nodded, her hands unclenching, and I felt my own shoulders loosen a bit. But the quiet came back fast, heavier now, and I watched Gloria, sitting there alone, her tears drying up. She didn't look powerful anymore, just small, fake, a fraud in a designer coat. And Clara still wouldn't meet my eyes. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, knowing this night had changed everything, and not just for Gloria. I sat in that hospital waiting room, the plastic chair digging into my back, the hum of the lights overhead buzzing like a fly I couldn't swat away. The place smelled like bleach and old coffee, and the clock on the wall ticked too slow, every second stretching out the mess we were all stuck in. Walter was stable now, the doctor said, but nobody was celebrating. Felicity sat across from me, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the floor like it might tell her what to do next. Paige was by the window, her reflection sharp against the dark glass, her foot still tapping like she couldn't stop moving. Clara was next to me, close but miles away, her hands folded tight in her lap. She hadn't said a word to me since we got here, and that silence was louder than anything. Gloria was at it again, sniffing into her tissue, her voice wobbly but loud. "I did everything for this family," she said, looking around like she expected us to nod along. "For you girls, for Walter, I've given my whole life to you." It was the same line she'd been spinning all night, and it landed like a wet rag. Paige turned fast, her eyes blazing. "You did it for yourself," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "Stop pretending this is about us." Felicity didn't even look up, just shook her head, her voice low. "We can't even pay our mortgage, Mom. You took everything, and you're still acting like the victim." Gloria's face went red, her hands dropping the tissue into her lap. "You don't understand," she started, but Paige cut her off. "No, you don't understand. We're done listening." That shut her up, and she sank back in her chair, her eyes darting around like she was looking for an escape. I watched it all, feeling the weight of what I'd started pressing down on me. Those papers I'd handed over had ripped this family apart, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it yet. Part of me wanted to fix it, to pull Clara close and tell her it'd be okay, but she wouldn't even look at me. The doctor came back, said Walter was awake, and Clara went in first. When she came out, her face was softer, but her eyes were still hard when they flicked my way. Walter wanted to see me next, and I nodded, standing slow, my boots heavy on the tile. Inside his room, the machines beeped steady, and he looked small under the white sheets, his skin gray but his eyes sharp. He waved me closer, his voice rough. "You knew all this," he said, not asking, just stating it. I nodded. "Yeah, took me a year to figure it out." He looked at me for a long moment, then asked, "If you knew what Clara knew, would you have let this continue?" It hit me hard, Clara, defending her mom even now, after everything. "No," I said. "I'd have stopped it." He nodded, slow, like that was enough. Back in the waiting room, Clara was waiting, her arms crossed. "You planned this," she said, her voice low and tight. "You waited for your moment to tear her down." I looked at her, my chest aching. "I didn't plan it like this," I said. "I just wanted the truth out. She's the one who made it a mess." Her eyes narrowed. "You could have told me first. You didn't have to do it like that." I shook my head. "Would you have listened? Or would you have told me to let it go, like always?" She didn't answer, just looked away, and that hurt worse than her words. Gloria perked up then, her eyes glinting like she'd caught a lifeline. "See? He's the one causing trouble," she said, her voice sweet again. "I made mistakes, but he's trying to ruin us." Paige snorted, but Clara didn't move, didn't argue, and that was it, the last straw. I felt it snap inside me, 5 years of trying, of hoping she'd choose me over them. I stood up, slow and deliberate, my hands steady even though my heart was racing. "I'm done," I said, my voice quiet but firm. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide. "What?" she said, like she hadn't heard me. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw it. She'd never pick me, not over this mess, not over her mom. "I'm done," I said again. And the room went still, everyone watching, even Gloria, her smug little smile fading. I turned and walked toward the door, my boots echoing, knowing I wasn't coming back. I stood in that hospital waiting room, the air thick with the sting of bleach and the weight of everything that had just gone down, my heart pounding in my chest like it wanted to break free. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, casting shadows on the faces of Clara's family. Paige by the window, her arms crossed tight, Felicity slumped in a chair, her eyes red and empty, and Gloria sitting there, her tissue crumpled, watching me like a hawk. Clara was in front of me, her hands clenched, her face pale and shocked after I'd said I was done. I could feel the eyes on me, the tension wrapping around us all, but I didn't care anymore. My fingers moved to my left hand, slow and sure, and I slid my wedding ring off. It felt light, too light for what it had meant to me all these years, and I held it out to Clara. Her eyes widened, her breath catching as I dropped it into her palm. "You never chose me," I said, my voice steady even though my insides were shaking. "You chose this, your mother's approval, every time." She stared at the ring, then at me, her mouth opening like she wanted to argue. "You don't mean that," she said, her voice small, almost a whisper. "I do," I said, and it was the truest thing I'd said all night. 5 years I'd spent trying to fit into her world, smiling through the jabs, the cold shoulders, the way they'd laugh me off like I was nothing. I'd done it for her, because I loved her, because I thought she'd see me one day. But she never did, not really. Even now, with Gloria's lies laid bare, Clara was still looking at her mom like she could fix it, like I was the one who'd gone too far. I couldn't live like that anymore. Felicity's head snapped up, her mouth dropping open, and Paige turned from the window, her eyes wide but not stopping me. Walter was still in his room, hooked up to machines, but I knew he wouldn't argue either. He'd seen it too, the way Clara stuck by her mom no matter what. Gloria's lips twitched, like she thought she'd won something, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of a glance. I turned and walked out, my boots heavy on the tile, the sound echoing in the quiet. The cold night air hit me hard as I pushed through the hospital doors, my breath fogging in front of me. I didn't look back, not at Clara, not at the family I'd tried so hard to belong to. My truck was in the lot, and I climbed in, the engine rumbling to life like it was the only thing I could count on. I drove home, the road blurring a little as my mind raced. It wasn't just the end of a night. It was the end of everything I'd built with Clara. A week later, I heard Walter filed for divorce. Paige and Felicity cut Gloria off, done with her excuses, her tears. The IRS swooped in, sniffing around her catering business, and it didn't take long for the whispers to start. Her reputation was toast, her fancy life crumbling fast. I didn't feel good about it, but I didn't feel bad either. She'd made her choices, same as Clara had. 2 weeks after that night, my phone rang, Clara's name lighting up the screen. I let it ring, my thumb hovering over the button, and then it went to voicemail. Her voice came through, soft and shaky. "I get it now," she said. "I see what she did, what I did. I'm sorry." I listened, standing in my empty apartment, the walls bare from where I'd started packing. She sounded like she meant it, but it didn't change anything. She'd picked her side every time it mattered, and I'd spent too long waiting for her to turn around. I didn't call back. I deleted the message and set the phone down, feeling lighter than I had in years. The next day, I signed the lease on a place in Boston, a fresh start far from Connecticut, far from Gloria's mansion and Clara's excuses. I boxed up what little I cared to keep, some clothes, my tools, a couple pictures of me and Clara from the early days, when I still thought we'd make it. The rest I left behind, like the ring I'd given her. She'd made her choice, and now I'd made mine. I loaded my truck and hit the road, the highway stretching out ahead, empty and quiet, just the way I needed it to be. I stood on the balcony of my new apartment in Boston, the salty breeze off the ocean brushing my face, the sound of waves crashing in the distance mixing with the hum of the city below. It was Thanksgiving again, months after that night at Gloria's, and I was a long way from Connecticut, physically, sure, but more than that, I was free. The air smelled clean, like salt and possibility, nothing like the heavy perfume of Gloria's dining room or the bleach of that hospital. My hands rested on the railing, steady, no ring on my finger, and I felt good, better than I had in years. Downstairs, my new place was warm, the table set with a spread I'd put together myself. Turkey, mashed potatoes, a pie I'd baked that wasn't half bad. No fancy centerpieces, no designer bags, just food and people who mattered. I'd invited some folks from my new life in Boston, guys from the investment firm I'd started, a neighbor who'd helped me move in, a couple friends I'd made at a bar down the street. They were good people, the kind who saw me, who didn't look through me like Clara's family always had. I'd launched that firm a few months back, small but growing, putting my knack for figuring things out to work in a way that paid off quiet and steady. It wasn't Gloria's flashy empire, but it was mine, built from scratch, no lies holding it up. I took a sip of my beer, the cold bottle sweating in my hand, and thought about how different this day felt. Last year, I'd been the outcast, sitting at the end of Gloria's table, swallowing their laughs, clutching that envelope like a lifeline. Now, I was hosting my own dinner, no drama, no secrets, just honest talk and laughter that didn't cut. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky orange and pink, and I let myself breathe it in, feeling the weight of the past slip off my shoulders. A package had come that morning, small and plain, no return address. I'd opened it on the kitchen counter, and there it was, my old wedding ring, the one I'd dropped into Clara's hand that night at the hospital. No note, just the ring, glinting under the light like a ghost from another life. I didn't know who sent it, Clara, maybe, or Paige cleaning out whatever was left of their mess, but it didn't matter. I picked it up, turned it over in my fingers, and smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a sad one, just a quiet one. I walked down to the beach after that, the sand cool under my boots, and stood where the waves lapped at the shore. I held the ring out, let it catch the light one last time, and tossed it into the water. It hit with a soft plink, gone in a second, swallowed by the ocean. I didn't need it anymore, didn't want it. That part of me was done, sunk deep where it belonged. Back inside, the doorbell rang, and I opened it to find my neighbor, Tom, holding a bottle of whiskey and grinning. "Figured we'd need this later," he said, and I laughed, stepping aside to let him in. Soon the place was full, chairs pulled up, plates clinking, voices overlapping in a way that felt right. We ate, we talked, we swapped stories about dumb stuff we'd done, about jobs and plans and the Red Sox game coming up. Nobody got left out, nobody got forgotten. I made sure of that. Toward the end of the night, I stepped back onto the balcony, the noise of the party fading behind me, and looked out at the water again. I thought about Gloria, her business gone, her family scattered, her name mud in Connecticut now. I thought about Clara, wondered if she was still picking up her mom's pieces or if she'd finally let go. I didn't hate them, didn't wish them ill, but I didn't miss them either. They were a chapter I'd closed, a table I'd walked away from. Next year, I'd do this again, host my own Thanksgiving, keep it simple, keep it real. I'd make sure there were gifts, too, nothing big, just small things to say I saw the people around me, especially the ones who'd been forgotten before, like I used to be. I turned back inside, the warmth of the room pulling me in, and joined the laughter, the clink of glasses, the life I'd built. This was my table now, and I wasn't invisible anymore.